The Epsilon Scalaris Prime orbital station had a reputation, and that reputation was immaculate. Suspended in the gravitational sweet spot between three gas giants in the Tertian system, the university facility represented the pinnacle of higher education for 17 different species across 4 galactic quadrants. Its halls were lined with photon-reactive metal that shifted colors based on the emotional states of passing students. Its laboratories contained equipment that could simulate conditions from 600 different planetary environments, and its cafeteria served over 2,000 dishes that wouldn't kill at least half the student body. That last bit was actually printed in the promotional materials, right there on page 47, as if culinary non-lethality was some kind of impressive achievement worth bragging about. The architecture itself was a testament to aggressive mediocrity in design, nothing too sharp for the Glinthara who absorbed nutrients through their skin, nothing too smooth for the Crelon who needed textured surfaces to navigate, and absolutely nothing that could be construed as offensive to the Yith collective, who found perpendicular angles religiously problematic. The result was a building that looked like someone had asked an artificial intelligence to design a structure while drunk, and the AI had complied out of spite. But it was prestigious. Graduation from Epsilon Scalaris meant something in the galactic job market. It meant you could tolerate living in a giant flying compromise for 4 standard cycles. It meant you could eat food that was technically edible. It meant you could attend lectures where the professor might be a sentient gas cloud or a hive mind fungus or, on particularly unfortunate days, a Vrelkian who communicated through interpretive bioluminescent flashing and thought anyone who needed actual words was intellectually inferior. Among the current student population of approximately 12,000 beings, there existed a clear social hierarchy, as there always does when you cram that many entities with varying limb counts into one pressurized environment. At the top stood the Velcrin, crystalline bipeds from the high-gravity world of Velcros 4. Known throughout the quadrant for their military efficiency, their architectural achievements, and their absolutely insufferable superiority complexes. They stood roughly 2.3 meters tall, their bodies composed of a silicon-based crystalline structure that refracted light in ways that made them appear perpetually dramatic. Each Velcrin featured unique geometric patterns in their transparent forms, like someone had trapped a prism inside a muscular humanoid shape and given it the personality of a bouncer who takes his job way too seriously. The Velcrin dominated the station's combat sports leagues, held most positions in student government, and had cornered the market on looking intimidating while doing absolutely mundane activities. Watching a Velcrin use the water fountain was like watching a diamond-encrusted warrior prepare for battle. Unnecessarily intense and vaguely threatening to everyone around them, Jask Interlock 7 was prime among them, at least in his own crystalline mind. He stood at the higher end of the Velcrin height spectrum, his internal structure featuring rare crimson inclusions that marked him as military nobility back home. His crew consisted of 5 other Velcrin, each selected for their ability to stand behind Jask and look menacing, which was essentially the only qualification needed. They'd spent the better part of 3 semesters establishing dominance over various other species, never quite crossing the line into expellable behavior, but dancing on that line with the confidence of someone whose family donates to the university's expansion fund. Their targets typically came from the softer species, the Quilnari, with their fuzzy bodies and 8 eyes that made them look perpetually worried. The Thesic, with their gaseous lower halves that made them easy to literally blow around, the Pondrin, who communicated through color changes and could be made to flash embarrassing hues with minimal effort. It was all very sophisticated bullying, the kind that relied on physical presence and social pressure rather than actual violence. The kind that university administrators could pretend not to notice because no one was technically bleeding, and several species didn't even have blood to bleed in the first place. Then came the human. Rico Hayes arrived at Epsilon Scalaris Prime on a Tuesday, which was unfortunate because the Velcrin always got aggressive on Tuesdays. Something about the station's light cycle on that particular day reminded them of their conquest celebrations back home. Rico emerged from the transport shuttle looking like someone had assembled a person from spare parts without checking if all the pieces came from the same kit. Average height by most species standards, about 1.75 meters, with a build that registered as not particularly impressive to anyone who bothered to look. Dark hair pulled back in a practical style. Skin that showed the kind of tan that came from actual sunlight rather than UV simulation pods. And eyes that held the vaguely amused expression of someone watching a situation unfold that they found more entertaining than concerning. The human wore the standard student uniform, adaptive fabric that adjusted to different body chemistries, but somehow made it look like they just rolled out of bed and couldn't be bothered to care about appearances. A data pad hung from one hip, a portable atmospheric analyzer from the other, because apparently humans needed to constantly check if the air would kill them, which was adorable in a pathetic sort of way. Earth, as it happened, was not on most species' radar for recruitment. The planet had been catalogued exactly once by a galactic survey team, 70 standard, years prior, and the report had been filed under probably not worth the effort in the archives. The survey team had spent approximately 14 minutes on the surface before their equipment started malfunctioning due to the excessive oxygen content, the terrifying gravity, and the immediate presence of what they classified as unreasonably aggressive local fauna. The final report consisted of a single line. Everything here is trying to kill everything else, including the plants. Earth received a classification level 9 Deathworld rating, which was a polite way of saying any sane species should avoid this place unless they've lost a bet or are conducting a sociological experiment on suffering. The planet didn't make it into general educational databases because who needs to teach students about a world where the dominant species evolved by being chased by things with big teeth and decided the best response was to chase those things right back? So when Rico Hayes' application arrived at Epsilon Scalaris Prime, the admissions committee saw Earth and thought it was probably some minor colony world. They saw acceptable test scores, a compelling essay about wanting to study xenobiology, and a recommendation letter from a professor of exoanthropology that praised the applicant's unique perspective on survival adaptations. They didn't see the warnings because they didn't look deep enough into the database. They didn't see the classification because it wasn't in the quick reference guide. They just saw another student from a species they'd never heard of, which described about 60% of their applicant pool anyway. The first encounter happened in Transit Hall 7, a long corridor connecting the dormitory sections to the academic wings. The hall featured the station's characteristic color-shifting walls, currently displaying a peaceful blue that indicated low stress levels among passers-by. Rico was walking to an introductory xenobiology lecture, datapad in hand, reviewing notes on Krelvin's circulatory systems, when Josk and his crew materialized from a side corridor with the casual menace of people who know exactly how intimidating they look and have practiced their entrance angles. "New arrival," Josk announced, his voice carrying that crystalline resonance that made everything sound like a pronouncement from on high. "You stand in the path of Velcrin." Rico looked up from the datapad, glanced at the 6 crystalline figures blocking the corridor, and displayed the kind of expression usually reserved for finding mildly inconvenient traffic. "The path is 8 meters wide." This was not the response Josk had expected. Most species, upon being confronted by 6 Velcrin in formation, typically displayed some combination of fear, submission, or elaborate apologizing. This strange, soft-bodied creature just looked tired. You will show respect, Jask continued, stepping forward. His internal structure caught the corridor lighting and scattered it into threatening rainbow patterns. You will acknowledge dominance. I'll acknowledge that you're standing between me and a lecture on xenobiology that starts in 9 minutes, Rico replied, still holding the data pad. Does that count? The other Velkrins shifted positions, forming a tighter semicircle. One of them, Krex Lattice 3, known for his particularly aggressive posturing, extended a crystalline arm to block Rico's path more obviously. You don't understand your position, Soft One. Rico looked at the extended arm, then at Krex, then back at the arm. I understand that touching someone without permission is assault under Station Regulation 4.7, subsection 3. I also understand that I've got 8 minutes now. So if we're doing this dominance thing, could we speed it up? The sheer audacity of this response actually confused Jask for a moment. In his experience, there were 2 types of responses to Velkrin intimidation. Immediate submission, or foolish aggressive posturing, that led to immediate submission. This weird middle ground of complete disinterest was uncharted territory. You're from where? One of the other Velkrin asked, Thena Fracture 9, who at least had the strategic sense to gather intelligence before committing to a confrontation. Earth, Rico said, pronouncing it the way humans did, with that slight emphasis on the vowel that made it sound almost pretty, which was an impressive linguistic feat for a planet that was basically a nightmare sphere. None of the Velkrin recognized the name. Why would they? But Jask's pride had already been engaged, and backing down now would be a weakness. Earth produces weak species, apparently. We get by, Rico said, then did something that would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists as either incredibly brave or catastrophically stupid. Walked forward directly toward Krex's extended arm. The Velkrin instinctively pulled back, just slightly, and Rico walked through the gap, continuing down the corridor at the same steady pace. The human didn't run, didn't hurry, didn't look back. Just walked away like the encounter had been a minor inconvenience. Like being threatened by 6 warrior species students was equivalent to dealing with slow-moving pedestrian traffic. Jask stood there, light refracting through his crystalline body in patterns that indicated confusion and rising anger, and watched the human disappear around the corner. In his 3 semesters at Epsilon Scholaris, no one had ever just walked away from him. That, he announced to his crew, cannot stand. Over the next 6 station days, the encounters escalated. Jask and his Velkrin made it their personal mission to teach this human about proper social hierarchy. They accidentally bumped into Rico in the cafeteria, sending the human's meal tray scattering. They blocked access to the library's entrance, forcing a 10-minute detour. They spread rumors about Earth being a reject colony populated by species too weak for proper worlds. Standard bully tactics, refined over generations of Velkrin asserting dominance over softer species. Rico's responses remained consistently underwhelming from an intimidation perspective. When the meal tray scattered, the human just gathered another meal. When the library was blocked, they used the secondary entrance. When the rumors spread, Rico seemed completely unaware or unconcerned with them. It was like trying to intimidate a rock. The rock doesn't care about your feelings, it just continues being a rock. This infuriated Jask more than any aggressive response could have. Anger he could work with, fear he could exploit. But this complete indifference to his existence? This was intolerable. The creature mocks us with its apathy, Jask declared during a strategy session in the Velkrin common area, a space they'd decorated with sharp geometric patterns and harsh lighting that made everyone look like they were perpetually plotting something. We must demonstrate consequences. Perhaps we should check the species database, Thena suggested, displaying the kind of rational thinking that would eventually save her from the upcoming disaster. We know nothing about Earth or its inhabitants. What is there to know? Krex dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his crystalline hand. It's small, it's soft, it bleeds, probably, and it doesn't know its place. The database won't change these facts. If they had checked the database, if they had gone past the preliminary entries and actually pulled up the full Survey Corps report, they would have found some interesting information. They would have learned that Earth's gravity was 1.4 times galactic standard, which meant every human carried approximately 40% more mass than their bodies visually suggested. They would have learned that Earth's atmospheric pressure was high enough to be classified as crush risk for 16 different species. They would have learned that humans evolved as persistence hunters, which was a polite way of saying they chased prey until the prey literally died from exhaustion, which was possibly the most terrifying hunting strategy in the known galaxy. They would have learned that Earth was home to creatures called bears and sharks and crocodiles and hippos and cassowaries and something called box jellyfish that could kill you by brushing against your skin, and that humans had looked at all these nightmare creatures and decided to make some of them into pets and entertainment. They would have learned that human children played something called contact sports for fun, where the objective was literally to crash into each other at high speeds, and this was considered wholesome entertainment. They would have learned that humans had a stress response system that literally flooded their bodies with combat drugs, adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins, that increased strength, dulled pain, and sharpened reflexes, essentially turning every human into a temporary berserker when threatened. But they didn't check, because Jask was proud and his crew followed his lead, and pride plus ignorance has historically been the recipe for spectacular mistakes across every known species in the galaxy. The planned confrontation was set for Recreation Bay 4, a multi-purpose space used for combat sports, physical training, and occasionally hosting events where different species could demonstrate their cultural practices without violating each other's taboos. The bay was isolated enough that no one would accidentally wander in, large enough to accommodate 6 Velcrin, and equipped with automated medical response systems because the university's insurance providers had insisted on them after the Krelvin juggling incident of 3 semesters ago. Jask and his crew cornered Rico entering the bay during evening hours. The human had apparently been using the space for personal exercise, which made sense because their species file, the brief one that the university had, mentioned something about humans needing regular physical activity to maintain health, which was weird, but whatever. Rico walked in wearing what appeared to be exercise clothing, carrying a water container, looking exactly as unconcerned as always. The human noticed the 6 Velcrin standing in formation near the center of the bay, and stopped, setting down the water container with careful deliberation. "Let me guess," Rico said, voice carrying that same tired quality from their first encounter. "This is where you teach me about respect and hierarchy, and how I should be more afraid of large crystalline beings?" "You learn quickly," Jask said, stepping forward. His internal structure was deliberately refracting the bay's lighting in aggressive patterns, reds and sharp whites that signaled combat readiness in Velcrin culture. But learning comes too late now. You will understand your place through physical correction. Physical correction, Rico repeated slowly, as if testing how the words tasted. "You mean you're going to try to beat me up because I walked through a hallway and didn't treat you like you were special? You disrespected Velcrin honor. Krex added, moving to flank the human. The other 4 Velkrin were spreading out, forming a loose circle, cutting off escape routes. There are consequences for such actions. Rico looked at each Velkrin in turn, expressions cycling through several emotions. Annoyance, resignation, something that might have been disappointment, and finally settling on what could only be described as tired acceptance. You really didn't check what kind of world I'm from, did you? It doesn't matter where you're from, Jask declared. You're here now, and here you will learn. Yeah, Rico said quietly, rolling shoulders in a way that somehow made the human's already unimpressive frame look even smaller. That's what I was afraid of. Then several things happened very quickly. Krex moved first, lunging forward with the kind of telegraphed attack that worked great on species who froze when scared. His crystalline fist came forward in an arc designed to connect with Rico's torso, calculated to cause pain without causing damage that would require official reporting. Rico moved, not jumped back, not dodged. Moved, shifted weight, redirected trajectory, and suddenly Krex's momentum was working against him. The Velkrin stumbled past where the human had been standing, and Rico's foot came up in a simple kick that caught Krex's leg at the joint. The crystalline structure of Velkrin bodies was incredibly strong, but it followed physical laws, same as anything else. Force applied at a joint, especially when the joint was weight-bearing and in motion, produced predictable results. Krex went down with a sound like wind chimes being thrown downstairs. The other Velkrin hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second too long against a species that evolved avoiding things with teeth and claws. Rico moved toward Thena next, not away from the circle but into it, which violated every prey response instinct the Velkrin expected. Thena's defensive posture was textbook Velkrin combat technique. Arms up, core protected, ready to absorb and redirect impact. Rico didn't aim for the protected core. The human dropped low, really low, gravity be damned, and swept Thena's legs. Another Velkrin hit the deck, and this time when they fell, Rico was already moving to the next target. Jask realized, somewhere in his crystalline mind, that this was not going according to plan. He signaled the other 3 to coordinate their attack. Standard pack tactics that the Velkrin had refined over centuries of military tradition. They moved together, synchronized, cutting off angles of escape. Rico didn't try to escape. The human went for the closest Velkrin, Jex Refraction 2, a heavy worlder even by Velkrin standards, and did something that would later be described in the incident reported as inadvisable but effective. Instead of trying to match strength against strength, Rico used Jex's own mass against him, guiding the Velkrin's momentum into a stack of exercise equipment. The crash was spectacular. "Stop moving," Jask commanded, frustrated that this small, soft creature kept being where it wasn't supposed to be. He lunged forward, both arms extended in a grabbing motion designed to immobilize. Rico ducked under the grab, and one of the human's elbows came up hard into what passed for Jask's solar plexus. The crystalline structure transmitted the impact through his entire body. And suddenly Jask understood why his combat instructors back on Velkros 4 had emphasized never underestimating a species just because it looked soft. The human's bones weren't soft. They were dense, reinforced by high gravity and evolutionary pressures that the Velkrin had never faced. Every strike from those small fists and elbows carried weight, real weight, the kind that came from growing up on a world where your skeleton needed to support 40% more mass than was standard. 2 more Velkrin rushed Rico from different angles, trying to use numbers to compensate for the human's unexpected competence. Rico grabbed one, Vress Fragment 11, by the arm, and used the Velkrin's own crystalline structure as a lever, applying pressure at the joint until Vress went down. The last standing Velcrin, Morth Clarity 6, actually managed to land a hit, a solid strike to Rico's shoulder that would have shattered bone in most species. Rico grunted, rolled with the impact, and came back with a punch to Morth's knee joint that produced an alarming crackling sound. The entire fight lasted approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds for 6 trained Velcrin warriors to be systematically dismantled by one human student who wasn't even breathing particularly hard afterward. Rico stood in the center of the recreation bay, surrounded by 6 Velcrin in various states of not standing anymore, and picked up the water container that had been set down at the beginning. Took a drink. Put it back down. For the record, Rico said to the groaning pile of crystalline beings, I came here to study xenobiology. I wrote a whole essay about peaceful coexistence and learning from different species. That was my whole thing. Krex tried to stand, failed, settled for sitting up. What are you? Tired, Rico answered. I'm really, really tired of this happening. That's when the recreation bay's automated medical alert system triggered, having detected multiple injuries requiring attention. That's when station security arrived, weapons drawn, expecting to find a major incident. That's when they found 6 Velcrin warriors looking like they'd lost an argument with a meteor shower, and one human drinking water and looking vaguely annoyed about the interruption to their exercise schedule. The security team, led by a Screeth named Officer Hillex, whose species resembled a cross between a turtle and a scorpion, took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many student altercations. Explanation? Hillex demanded, mandibles clicking in what passed for annoyed resignation in Screeth body language. They tried to teach me about respect, Rico said, gesturing at the Velcrin. I gave them a practical demonstration of Earth's gravitational education system. The security review took 3 station days. They pulled footage from the recreation bay's monitoring systems, which existed specifically because students kept getting into altercations in isolated spaces, and watched the entire 90-second incident from multiple angles. They brought in specialists to analyze the combat techniques. They interviewed witnesses who'd seen the earlier confrontations. And someone, somewhere in the administrative chain, finally thought to actually check Earth's full database entry. The meeting that followed involved Station Administrator Quelix, a Hyven whose species resembled a mantis made of living copper, Security Chief Hillex, Dean of Students Vortes from the gaseous Yith Collective, and about 6 other officials whose primary job was to ensure that the university didn't get sued or shut down for negligence. Earth, Quelix read from the report, his translator device rendering his clicking language into standard galactic trade, is a Class 9 Deathworld, gravity 1.42 times galactic standard. Atmospheric composition includes 21% oxygen. He paused at that number, mandibles spreading in alarm. 21%? That's a fire hazard classification. It gets worse, Hillex added, pulling up additional data. The dominant species, humans, are classified as persistence predators with retained carnivorous traits. They evolved by literally running prey to death over distances of up to 40 kilometers. Their skeletal structure is reinforced for high-impact survival. Their muscle fiber density is approximately 30% higher than most comparable species. And they have an autonomous stress response system that increases physical capabilities during threat assessment. So we've been housing an apex predator, Dean Vortes wheezed through his translation unit, which made his gaseous communications sound like philosophical contemplation. And nobody thought to mention this. The initial survey report was filed under a legacy classification system, an assistant administrator explained, looking at her datapad like it had personally betrayed her. The warning flags didn't transfer when we updated our database formats 18 standard years ago. Earth registered as a minor colony world in our quick reference system. Minor colony world, Quelix repeated slowly. The planet is classified as hostile to 96% of known species, and we marked it as a minor colony world. To be fair, Hillix clicked diplomatically, the human in question did demonstrate considerable restraint. The footage shows multiple instances where Hayes could have inflicted significantly more damage, but chose not to. No permanent injuries to any Velcrin, mostly joint stress and impact trauma that will heal in a few days. Restraint, Vortes echoed. The human showed restraint while dismantling 6 Velcrin warriors in under 2 minutes. That's what we're calling this situation? An awkward silence filled the administrative chamber. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes simultaneously that they've been operating under catastrophically incorrect assumptions. What do we do? Someone finally asked. Quelix's mandibles clicked in thought. What we should have done initially. Actually read the relevant files. It's clear that the Velcrin initiated all confrontations. Hayes repeatedly attempted to disengage. The final altercation was a clear case of self-defense against multiple assailants. Under station regulations, Hayes acted within acceptable parameters. So the human faces no consequences? Another official asked, sounding almost hopeful. Correct. The Velcrin, however, will face expulsion for coordinated assault and harassment. We can't have students forming attack groups against other students, regardless of how badly they miscalculated their target. The decision was announced the next morning via official station channels. Jasque and his crew received expulsion notices, their families were notified, and arrangements were made for their immediate departure. The official incident report was filed under assault, multiple perpetrators, self-defense response, classification failure by administration. A separate internal memo circulated among university staff with the subject line, "Remember to check full database entries before admitting students from unknown worlds." Rico received a formal apology from the administration, delivered by Quelix personally in a meeting that lasted approximately 10 minutes and featured the station administrator carefully positioning himself near the exit, just in case. "We apologize for the classification oversight," Quelix said, his translator rendering his clicks into precise, formal language. "We should have properly vetted all potential safety concerns before your arrival." "It's fine," Rico said, sitting in a chair that was designed for Krelvin proportions and therefore way too large, making the human look even smaller and therefore somehow more unsettling now that everyone knew what Earth actually was. "Happens more often than you'd think." "This has happened before. I've been to 3 other universities before this one," Rico explained with that same tired patience. 2 trade stations and 1 research facility. Every time, someone decides the human is an easy target. Every time, I end up having this conversation afterward. Quelix's mandibles clicked in what his species equivalent to sympathetic horror. Why continue applying to institutions if this pattern persists? "Because I want to study xenobiology," Rico said simply. "Your university has the best program for comparative evolutionary adaptations. I wrote a whole thesis proposal on predator-prey dynamics in peaceful coexistence. It's kind of ironic now, I guess." "The irony is not lost on us," Quelix assured. "For what it's worth, you're welcome to continue your studies here. We'll be implementing additional protocols to prevent future incidents." "Protocols?" Rico repeated, sounding doubtful. "Like what?" "We're adding Deathworld classifications to all student profiles. It will be visible to anyone who accesses basic information. Consider it a warning label." A warning label, Rico said. Great. That won't make social integration weird at all. But it did help, in its own way. The incident spread through the student population with the speed of scandals everywhere. Embellished, exaggerated, and entertaining. The story of 6 Velcrin warriors getting systematically dismantled by one small human became legend within a week. Details were added that never happened. Some versions claimed Rico had fought 20 Velcrin. Others claimed the human had used exotic earth martial arts techniques with names like karate and jujitsu, and the ancient art of hitting people really hard. The truth was simultaneously less and more impressive than the legends. Rico hadn't used exotic techniques, just basic self-defense, combined with the kind of reflexes that came from growing up on a world where everything was heavier, faster, and trying to kill you. The human hadn't sought out combat, had actively tried to avoid it multiple times. But when cornered, when given no other option, the Deathworld survivor had done what Deathworld survivors do: survived. The response from other students was interesting. The Quilnari, previously frequent targets of Velcrin harassment, started actively seeking Rico out, not to ask for protection, but to express appreciation that someone had finally stood up to the bullies. The Thessic spread a story through their cultural networks about the Quiet Thunder, their poetic name for Rico, which sounded much cooler in their original language. The Crylon, a species that valued direct action and practicality, simply nodded respectfully whenever Rico passed. The remaining Velcrin students at Epsilon Scolaris, those who hadn't been part of Jasque's crew, went through their own interesting adjustment. Some maintained their species' traditional pride and pretended nothing had happened. Others took the lesson to heart and started actually treating smaller species with something approaching respect. A few even approached Rico to apologize for their species' behavior, which the human accepted with the same patient tiredness that characterized all their interactions. Rico's xenobiology classes continued. The human sat in lectures about Krelvin circulatory systems, hive and hive mind coordination, and Yith collective consciousness sharing, taking notes with the same methodical focus as before the incident. The other students gave Rico more space now, not out of fear exactly, but out of a newfound respect for personal boundaries that should have existed from the beginning. Professor Ixlith, a Yith collective educator who taught advanced evolutionary adaptation theory, called on Rico during a lecture about predator evolution. Hayes, your species evolved as hunters, correct? Persistence hunters, yeah, Rico confirmed, looking up from their notes. Can you explain the psychological adaptations required for such a strategy? Most predators rely on speed or strength. Your species evolved to simply continue until prey collapsed? Pretty much, Rico said. We're not the fastest species on Earth. We're not the strongest. But we can keep going when other species physically can't. Our thermoregulation through sweating, our energy-efficient bipedal movement, our ability to carry water and food with us, it all adds up to a species that can just keep chasing until whatever we're chasing literally dies from exhaustion. The classroom went quiet. Several species present were prey evolution, and the casual way Rico described hunting something to death triggered some deep instinctual discomfort. But, Rico continued, that same adaptation is why humans are good at things like long-distance running, endurance sports, and apparently university studies that require sitting through 4-hour lectures without breaks. That got a few clicks of laughter from the Screeth students and some color-shifting amusement from the Quilnari. Ixlith's gaseous form rippled in what his species considered approval. An excellent example of how evolutionary traits can be adapted to peaceful purposes. Your thesis proposal on predator-prey, peaceful coexistence seems particularly relevant to your own experiences. Yeah, Rico agreed. Though I'd prefer if my research stayed theoretical and didn't require additional practical demonstrations. More laughter. The tension eased. Life at Epsilon Scalaris Prime continued, as it always did, with students from dozens of species attempting to coexist in a giant floating compromise station that served food rated as probably non-lethal. Rico's thesis developed over the following semester. The research examined how predator species and prey species could coexist peacefully when environmental pressures were removed. Essentially, what happens when you take creatures designed to eat each other and put them in a safe university environment with academic goals and cafeteria food. The paper drew on examples from Earth, where humans had domesticated dozens of species that were either predators or prey, creating peaceful coexistence through mutual benefit and understanding. It was, unintentionally, the most threatening academic document in the university's history. Reading between the lines, the thesis essentially said, "My species conquered a death world by figuring out how to make everything else work with us, and here's how we did it." The academic committee that reviewed it couldn't decide if it was brilliant or terrifying. They settled on both. The thesis defense was attended by more students than most defenses drew, partially because Rico's reputation had spread throughout the station, and partially because xenobiology majors wanted to see how a predator species analyzed its own evolutionary advantages. Rico presented the research with the same calm, methodical approach that characterized everything the human did. Data, analysis, conclusions, all delivered in a tone that suggested discussing predator-prey dynamics was as normal as discussing stellar cartography or quantum mathematics. During the question period, a Velcrin student, one of the ones who'd apologized earlier, raised a crystalline hand. Your research suggests that predator instincts can be controlled through socialization and cultural development. Do you believe this applies to all predator species, or specifically to humans? Good question, Rico acknowledged. The research suggests it's possible for most species given the right environmental conditions and motivation. Humans didn't stop being predators. We just redirected those instincts toward other goals. Competition in sports instead of hunting. Problem solving instead of stalking prey. We're still predators. We just found better things to hunt than each other. Better things to hunt, the Velcrin repeated. Such as? Rico smiled, just slightly. Knowledge, understanding, solutions to complex problems. Turns out the same stubbornness that let us chase antelope for 40 kilometers also makes us really persistent researchers who won't give up on difficult questions. The thesis received highest honors. Rico graduated top of the xenobiology class, received multiple job offers from research institutions across 4 quadrants, and politely declined all of them to accept a position back on Earth at the Global Xenobiology Institute, which apparently wanted someone who understood both human and alien perspectives on evolutionary adaptation. The day before departure, Rico ran into Fracture 9 in one of the main corridors. The Velcrin had stayed at the university after Jasque's crew was expelled, had actually apologized personally for the incident, and had gone on to become a vocal advocate for better species integration policies. "Hayes," Thena said, her crystalline structure displaying patterns of respect. "Safe travels." "Thanks," Rico replied. "You too. Good luck with your advocacy work." "Can I ask you something?" Thena said. "That day in the recreation bay, you could have hurt us much worse. Why didn't you?" Rico considered the question. "Because that's not the point of being strong. The point is knowing when not to use it. Earth taught us to survive, but civilization taught us when survival doesn't require destroying everything around us." That's very philosophical for someone who took down 6 warriors in 90 seconds. Yeah, well, Rico shrugged. I contain multitudes. It's a human thing. The transport shuttle departed the following morning, carrying Rico Hayes back toward Earth, back toward the Deathworld that had produced a species capable of both extreme violence and extreme restraint. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd witnessed the semester's events, that a predator species from one of the most hostile worlds in known space had come to study peaceful coexistence. And the lesson had been learned by everyone except the human who tried to teach it. The incident report remained in Epsilon Scalaris Prime's files, a cautionary tale about assumptions and classifications, and the importance of actually reading the full database entry before admitting students from unknown worlds. It was referenced in administrative training materials. It became the answer to the question, why do we need to check Deathworld classifications? Jask Interlock 7 returned to Velcross 4 in disgrace, his military family deeply disappointed that he'd managed to get expelled from university not by academic failure, but by picking a fight with something from a Class 9 Deathworld. The story spread through Velcrin's social networks as a cautionary tale about pride and assumptions. Some found it funny. Most found it embarrassing. All of them learned the same lesson. Don't judge a species by its size. Back on Earth, Rico filed reports with the Global Xenobiology Institute about the semester's experiences, the incident with the Velcrin, and the general social dynamics of a multi-species educational facility. The reports were added to humanity's growing database about alien species, filed under interspecies relations and cultural misunderstandings, and why we need to include Deathworld warnings in our university applications. And somewhere in the galactic database, Earth's entry remained unchanged. Class 9 Deathworld, unsuitable for most species, dominated by persistence predators who evolved by being too stubborn to stop chasing things. The warning was there. It had always been there. Someone just needed to actually read it. The moral of the story, if there was one, was simple. Check your sources, read the full reports, and never assume that something small and soft from an unknown world is an acceptable target. Because sometimes that small, soft thing is from a planet where everything is trying to kill everything else. And the species that survived that environment didn't survive by being easy prey. They survived by being the thing that other things learned not to chase. And Rico Hayes, xenobiology graduate and reluctant legend of Epsilon Scalaris Prime, went on to have a perfectly ordinary career studying evolutionary adaptations, publishing research papers, and occasionally telling stories about that one semester where some crystalline jerks learned why you should always check what kind of world someone's from before starting a fight. The galaxy continued spinning. Students continued studying. Bullies continued existing. But at least one university now had a policy requiring Deathworld classification verification, and that was something.